Moving on from the last tutorial, where we looked at how to work with alpha channels, either ones that we created or the ones that we were supplied with, we'll now look at some features to modify those alpha channels. So let's quickly just set up a very simple green screen onto here. So view the alpha and just refine our key a bit. So under the Effects tab, there's some keyer tools in here and down this column. So let's look at Show Key. At the moment, if I look at the RGB channels, we can obviously see our foreground content. What Show Alpha does is it brings the alpha channel into the RGB channels. So if you like, it's a router from alpha to RGB. So where we have effects that primarily work on the RGB channels, but for whatever reason we want them to do something specific to the alpha channel, this is a way of routing from one to the other. And as we saw in the last tutorial, to get a mask from the RGB channels into the alpha channel, we would use external key. Clear key does exactly what you'd expect it to. If I go to the alpha channel now, you can see that it's completely removed the alpha channel that was created. There are some scenarios where you need to do this. For example, perhaps you've used a mask to correct a particular area, but you don't want that mask to define a composite later on in your stack of processes. Let's just make a quick comp out of this. So I'm just going to add a black solid background and add a comp 3D. And since I want the black solid to be the background, it needs to be on input 1 and this needs to be on input 2. So a quick way of reordering is just to remove and put back. The last thing you put down will take the highest number. So now we have a basic composite. So back to our alpha modifying tools. We can invert our mask, which fairly obviously just does a negative of the alpha channel. We can grow and shrink the alpha channel. So if I add grow and put in some parameters, we can see we're encompassing more of the background. Or I could change that for a shrink, or actually I could just change it here to filter out more of the edge. Blur alpha and foreground blur are actually also included in the general blur node. They're just here for shortcuts. So blur alpha is set by default to do just that, to blur only the alpha channel, not the RGB channels. And you can choose what type of blur you're using here, and indeed you can override whether it is blurring anything more than the alpha channel in this list. Foreground blur is quite interesting in that it's designed specifically to blur items that have been shot against a different background. And just to prove a point, I'm going to go into the green screen and I'm just going to undo its hue suppression to bring the green back. So if I wanted to defocus her against this black background, if I used a normal blur, then obviously if I just blur the RGB channels, that's only going to blur her and not the matte. So I would instinctively go for RGBA to blur the alpha channel as well, but we can see the problem that we get is obviously she's shot against a green background, and so as we blur, the green and her foreground are flowing together. So this is exactly what the foreground blur is designed to compensate for. If I switch this instead to the foreground mode, which is the same as choosing it directly from the Effects tab, we can see that we don't get that. That what we actually get is a blur that is properly blurring the foreground against its new background, even though technically they're not actually together. Let's just put that hue suppression back on. Also down here are two varieties of crop. Crop does what you'd expect it to, just gives you a crop from the 4 straight edges. You can choose whether the crop fills the foreground with a flat colour, in which case you can then choose that colour from here. Or alternatively, you can choose whether it's only going to crop the alpha channel. So in this case it's leaving the foreground untouched, but cropping the alpha channel, which will give a cleaner edge. To a certain extent there's some level of duplication going on in here, because in fact the green screen keyer actually has its own crop anyway. So in practice you wouldn't actually put a crop downstream of a green screen keyer because you've already got one. And actually you've also got one on the layer of the comp. But I'm just doing this just to show the crop node in action. There's also crop expand, which does something slightly different. Rather than fill the cropped area with a flat color, instead it fills it with an extrapolation of the edge that it's cropping from. And again, it's cropping the alpha channel as you'd expect. So this can be quite useful for making up backgrounds and certain effects and so on. In the keying tools down here, there's a couple of things to look at. Stroke is just a border to the key. So we have a width control and a color control. Edge build is sort of related to stroke, but it's quite a clever way of dealing with some troublesome edges in matting. Now I could add it as a separate node using this, but actually the green screen key has got one built in, so it's probably easier to show it off that. So if I zoom right in to this edge, we can see that the hair has a highlighted edge, and that's because that's actually the luminance value of the green screen behind. And obviously now I've put it on a black background, that probably isn't correct. So what edge build does is it goes round the last pixel of our foreground and redoes the anti-aliasing to the new background. So if I toggle it between on and off, you can see how it's correcting that edge. So with the green screen keyer, you can use it directly from in here, and for every other type of keyer, you can add it as a separate node. If you use this, just be sure that your mat is good and solid, because otherwise any small holes in your mat in the middle could trigger the edge build operation. The other item in keyer tools, screen build, we'll look at this when we do some green screen keying for real. Essentially what it does is it helps us make a clean version of the green screen, which then opens up some possible tricks using a combination of chroma keying and difference matting to get very accurate green screens. You'll remember that we also looked at keying using the color corrector, and that's also got some interesting additions to process keys. So again, to get our mat, we'll go to Select, and we'll export the inside of our selection, or a mat. View the alpha so we can see what we're doing, and we'll pick a color to begin our keying. Now of course I could and should use all these controls to make my mat as good as possible, but just to show off some features, I'm just going to loosen this back so that I've got some holes in my mat, because within the color corrector we also have these two levels of key correction. They both have the same list of features. There's just two of them, so you can have two different things cascaded per layer. And one of them is fill holes and one of them is remove sparks. They're effectively the negative of each other. Fill holes will fill in any tiny black areas in an otherwise white area of the mask. Remove sparks will do the opposite. So for example, if I select this and give it a value, we can see it's tuning out those small areas of the mask. We have to be careful with it because of course excessively it's going to destroy fine detail, but it's designed only to deal with very tiny holes. Also within the color corrector, there's a key blur. Although these tools are designed to work with the selection that's made here, you can also feed alpha channels in from other processes. And what you'd do is you'd simply select and from here and then choose where your alpha is coming from. So in this case, the source alpha channel. And then the alpha channel that's being worked on would be the combination of what's provided in the alpha channel coming in and what's restricted by here.